The Battle of Rorke's Drift was fought during the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879. It resulted in the highest number of Victoria Crosses ever awarded in a single action in the British Army, and of course it inspired the epic film Zulu. Now, I won't go into the reasons for the war as I've covered them in another video, so look out for the link on that one, but suffice to say it was, quite frankly, totally contrived by the British, or more particularly the British High Commissioner in South Africa, Sir Bartle Frere, and his military commander, Lord Chelmsford. Having presented the Zulu King Ceshwayo with an ultimatum that he couldn't accept, the British launched an invasion in January 1879. The main column, under Chelmsford himself, invaded Zululand from the mission station at Rorke's Drift. Rorke's Drift was named after Jim Rorke, who had built a trading station on the border between the British colony of Natal and the independent Zulu kingdom along the Buffalo River. By 1877, a Swedish missionary, Otto Witt, had converted the trading post into a mission station. And the mission station was commandeered by Chelmsford as his starting point for the invasion. Following the departure of Chelmsford's invading army, one small contingent of redcoats had been left behind at Rorke's Drift, which was to be used as a supply depot. 80 men of B Company, the 2nd Battalion, the 24th Foot Regiment, under Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. Bromhead came from a military family. Members had fought alongside General Wolfe at Quebec, and 2 of them had fought at Battle of Waterloo. But despite his pedigree, he suffered from deafness and was definitely not seen as a high flyer. He'd been in the army 10 years and had still only achieved the rank of lieutenant. And here he was with B Company on guard duty in the back end of nowhere, while the rest of the 24th were going off to war. With Bromhead as their officer, the men of the B Company were fortunate to have as their senior non-commissioned officer Colour Sergeant Frank Bourne. This son of Sussex was just 23 years old and had been promoted to Colour Sergeant when he was just 20. At the time, he was the youngest Colour Sergeant in the British Army, and he was affectionately known by his troops as the Kid. Contrary to popular beliefs, the 24th Regiment of Foot was not a Welsh regiment. It did have a recruiting depot in Brecon in South Wales and would later become the South Welsh Borderers Regiment. But at the time, they were also known as the 2nd Warwickshires, and they recruited from the Midlands of England around the Birmingham area. And whilst the recruiting depot at Brecon had resulted in 5 Joneses and 5 Williams in B Company, the majority of the defenders of Rorke's Drift were actually English. In fact, there were as many Irish as Welsh at the battle. Also at Rorke's Drift was a small team from the Army Commissariat, the logistics part of the army, charged with looking after and then moving supplies from there up to the main column. Meanwhile, Otto Witt's house had been commandeered and turned into a hospital with 35 patients, under the care of Irish-born surgeon James Reynolds. Now that the invasion column had crossed into Zululand, the camp had lapsed into a dull routine of garrison duty. Meanwhile, down at the actual ford, Lieutenant John Chard from the Royal Engineers was overseeing a small team of fellow engineers constructing a pontoon crossing across the Buffalo River. The garrison commander, Major Spalding, was keen to move forward and join the main column ASAP and see some action, as indeed were most of the men of B Company of the 24th Foot. So on the morning of the 22nd of January, he decided to ride 12 miles back into Natal to chivvy up the two companies who were supposed to be coming to relieve them. So get up there fast so they could go and see some action. Before leaving at around midday on the 22nd of January, he consulted the army list to see who was the most senior officer at the station in his absence that day. It happened to be the Royal Engineer down at the Drift, Lieutenant Chard. Having informed Chard that he was now in temporary command, Spalding rode off to help Marker and said he'd be back by nightfall. Chard continued working down by the crossing on the Buffalo River, and Bromhead's B Company continued their boring and slightly relaxed day at the mission station. Meanwhile, 10 miles away at Isandlwana in Zululand, the British were about to receive their greatest defeat at the hands of a native African army during Queen Victoria's reign. I've actually produced a video all about that battle, the Battle of Isandlwana. There's a link at the end of this video and also in the descriptions below. So this is just a very quick synopsis of what happened. Earlier that morning, 22nd of January 1879, Chelmsford had divided his column into two. He personally led half of it further into Zululand to find and engage the main Zulu army. And the other half were left at the camp at Isandlwana with orders to follow on behind. While Chelmsford was off on his wild goose chase, the Zulus had manoeuvred themselves behind his half of the army and launched a surprise attack on the British force left at Isandlwana. The story of the battle is incredible, both for the bravery shown by both sides, so please do check out my other video on it. Suffice to say, the Zulus overwhelmed the British force of 1,500 men. Only a handful of Europeans escaped the slaughter. The garrison at Rorke's Drift could hear the distant crackle of gunfire from Isandlwana, but were totally oblivious as to what was going on. Surgeon Reynolds, together with a local army chaplain, a man called Padre George Smith, and the Swedish missionary Otto Witt, ascended the hill behind Rorke's Drift in an unsuccessful effort to get a better view. At around 3:30, the men up on the hill, which by the way is called the Oscarberg in honour of the Swedish king, suddenly saw some riders galloping towards the mission station. The breathless riders conveyed the unbelievable news to Bromhead that the British camp at Isandlwana, had fallen. Meanwhile, down at the drift, two more riders were conveying the same news to Chard. One of those riders, a colonial officer by the name of Ardendorf, then rode on to the station, calling over his shoulder that he would stay and fight. It's a matter of debate, actually, as to whether Ardendorf did stay and fight. Records conflict. Chard secured the pontoons in the river and then made his way back up to Rorke's Drift and conferred with his fellow officers. Should they stay or should they run? It was now that Acting Assistant Commissary James Dalton made a crucial intervention. James Langley Dalton was a 46-year-old former sergeant in the 85th Foot Regiment. He had actually retired from the army in 1871 after 22 years of service and had emigrated to South Africa. At the outbreak of hostilities, he re-enlisted and was now in that small commissariat team or logistics team at Rorke's Drift. He urged the officers to stand and fight and suggested that they could use the stores in the storehouse to build barricades and fortify the mission station. Chard, as officer in command, agreed with Dalton, and a 4-foot-high defensive perimeter was constructed using 200-pound Hessian sacks of mealie bags. An inner barricade was then built across the compound using biscuit boxes, each of which weighed 90 pounds. At 4:30, the Zulu army emerged from round the Oscarberg hill, 4,000 of them, against the 130 men at Rorke's Drift mission station. These Zulus had been the reserve of the victorious army over at Isandlwana, and as such, as the reserve, hadn't played much of an active role in the fighting. And they were keen to have a bit of the glory too. Having chased the fugitives down to the Buffalo River, they'd actually crossed the border into Natal to basically see what loot they could find. Crossing the border into Natal had been expressly forbidden by King Cetshwayo. But their commander, a man called Dabula Mazi Kamapandi, was the 40-year-old half-brother of the king, and he hoped that his family connection, together with a successful raid into Natal, would smooth away any anger from Cetshwayo. And the 4,000 Zulus prepared to attack. Most were veterans in their 30s and 40s, stamping their feet, the ground shaking every time their high kicks hit the ground, drumming their assegais against their cowhide shields, and as they advanced towards the British, swinging their giant shields to the left to create an optical illusion of even more Zulus coming on to attack the British. And as they finally charged, the British opened fire at about 600 yards. Absolutely wild, mainly inaccurate fire, but slowly, when it got to about 450 yards, their shots started to count. In fact, Private James Dunbar actually killed 8 Zulus with 8 successive shots. This initial attack by the Zulus got to within 50 yards of the British line before it just simply ran out of steam and the Zulus started to seek cover from the fire. Meanwhile, Zulus armed with rifles positioned themselves up on the slopes of the Oscarberg Hill overlooking the mission station, about 300 yards away, and they kept up a fire on the British garrison for the next 10 hours. Despite claims from some sources and in the film Zulu, most of the rifles used by the Zulus at Rorke's Drift were not the latest weapons captured from the British at Isandlwana. They were older weapons that had been bought from traders over the preceding decades. Nevertheless, they were hitting the defenders in Rorke's Drift. Corporal William Allen was hit in the arm. Private Fred Hitch received a slug in his shoulder. Dalton was hit in the chest. The Zulus concentrated their actual attacks on the barricade, the 4-foot barricade in front of the hospital. Time and time again that afternoon, they were able to vault the barricade and clashed with the British. And time again, they were driven back by bayonet charges by the British. Eventually, about an hour after the fighting had started, Chard pulled his men back to a newly constructed barrier that had hastily been constructed at sort of right angles to the hospital. It was from this safety that Corporal Frederick Sheese of the Natal Mounted Police launched a daring solo attack. He crept back along the wall of mealie bags and killed 3 Zulus who were hiding behind it, firing on the defenders. The Zulus now swept across the deserted mealie bag barricade and launched a ferocious attack on 3 sides of the exposed hospital. The hospital was a strangely constructed building. While some of the rooms led out onto the veranda, which now faced the deserted mealie bag barricade, 3 rooms at the back of the hospital were not connected either internally to any hallways or anything, or indeed to each other. The only way in and out was through a door that led outside. Outside, where the Zulus were now gathering. The terrified British soldiers inside each cubbyhole were completely trapped. And as the defenders pointed their rifles out of the shattered doors that were being ripped apart by the Zulu assegais or through loopholes in the mud walls, strong Zulu hands would try and grab them, either the bayonet or the gun or indeed their own arm. This was the fate of Private Joseph Williams, who was actually pulled through the smashed door and repeatedly stabbed by the frenzied Zulu warriors outside. I want you to just pause and imagine the scene for a moment. Maybe you're in a cubbyhole with 2 able-bodied soldiers, a few walking wounded, and a couple of bedridden patients stuck in a small room with almost no natural daylight. And what natural daylight there was fast fading into the African night. Can you imagine the heat that was in that room on a day where the temperatures hit 40 degrees centigrade? The smell of sweat and gun smoke, the absolute din every time someone fired a rifle in this confined space. Zulus shouting outside, the door buckling under their attacks, and absolutely no idea what's happening elsewhere in the hospital or in the battle at all. And now thick acrid smoke starts to fill the room, because the Zulus had set fire to the thatched roof of the hospital. Private John Williams, a 23-year-old who joined the army under an assumed name when his girlfriend became pregnant, his real surname was Fielding, grabbed a broken pickaxe and he started to try and smash a hole from their cubby hole into the adjoining room. With limited space and a broken implement, his work was painfully slow, but eventually he made a hole big enough to crawl through. And as he did so, Private Henry Hook pushed patients through the hole, whilst at the same time firing and bayoneting any Zulu who entered that room. Williams was now in the next room, working his way through the far wall. It took him a full 15 minutes to break through, and another 20 minutes to start to evacuate all the men from the room. You know, how long must those 35 minutes have felt to the men trapped in that room? And as they all started to move through that hole into the next room, one of the defenders, Private Walters, decided on another course of action. He decided to hide in the wardrobe in the abandoned room. And amazingly, when the Zulus broke into the room, they were so intent on chasing the fleeing party led by Hook and Williams, they ignored the wardrobe. With the thatch above him now firmly on fire and the room heating up, Walters decided it was time to exit. He grabbed a black coat that he found in the wardrobe, he put it over his body, and then in the dark of the night he ran unnoticed out through the Zulus. More about him later in my story. Back in the hospital, Private Williams was digging his way through his third wall of the night, using not just the broken pickaxe, but his bayonet and his bare hands. His hands were red raw by the end of the night, and he carried those scars for the rest of his life. They were now able, however, to escape into the last room, the room at the far eastern end of the hospital. From there, it was possible to actually get out of the hospital by dropping out of a window 6 feet above the ground, onto the ground below. However, if the sick and wounded men survived that 6-foot fall, they'd actually find themselves in a no man's land, as the rest of the garrison had fallen back about 2 hours previously to that line of biscuits that we talked about earlier. So when they dropped out of that window, they were now 50 metres from safety. It was now that two more heroes appeared. Lance Corporal William Allen and Private Fred Hitch, who had both been wounded by Zulu rifle fire earlier in my story, ran at the distance of about 2 tennis courts from the biscuit boxes to the window. Hitch put his injured shoulder against the wall and then basically acted with his other shoulder as a step down for people to step out of the window, whilst Allen, also with only one useful arm, helped them down from Hitch onto the floor and pointed them towards the biscuit boxes. The last man to leave the burning hospital was Private Henry Hook, who carried another injured man by the name of Connolly on his back to the safety of those biscuit boxes. It was now 9:30 p.m. It had taken 4 hours to evacuate the hospital by digging through 3 walls. 27 of the 35 sick men in the hospital had been rescued. The fighting in the rest of the mission station was going on without a proper break. The British had been reduced to an area about the size of a tennis court, not much more than that. But with 20,000 rounds of ammunition available, they were able to put down a ferocious and relentless fire. In fact, the barrels of their guns got so hot that many defenders ripped their red tunics to wrap around the barrels to provide protection to their blistered hands. The recoil of the Martini Henry rifle, which weighs about 9 pounds, was well known and was made worse that night as the gun chambers began to foul with so much firing. It's estimated that each man fired about 100 rounds that night. So if you can imagine now, we have 100 thumps in the shoulder from a 9-pound rifle butt. The defenders' shoulders were so swollen and badly bruised from the recoils that actually many of them were actually, by the end of the fight, were actually holding their guns away from themselves and firing with no support. As the night wore on, the colossal frame of Padre George Smith stalked amongst the defenders. This 6'6", 18.5 stone preacher from Norfolk, with a bald head and long flowing red beard, worked tirelessly through the night, distributing ammunition. Going amongst the men and crying, "Don't swear, men, don't swear, but shoot them, boys, shoot them." For the rest of his career, he would be known as Ammunition Smith. Again and again the Zulus attacked through the night, but by setting the hospital ablaze, they had inadvertently helped the British by illuminating their own attacks. And now, as the flames started to die down a bit, another hero appeared. Surgeon Reynolds' white fox terrier would run along the barricade and bark every time Zulus came near, alerting the weary British defenders that another attack was on its way. And meanwhile, his master, Surgeon Reynolds, operated through the night in the open air, by the light of the burning hospital. And by this rudimentary light and with no anaesthetic, he actually removed 35 pieces of bone from Private Hitch's shoulder. By 4 a.m, the last flames from the hospital fire had dimmed, and in the darkness, the defenders waited for the next attack. It never came. As the sun rose just after 5 a.m, the Zulus seemed to have vanished. The air smelled of burnt thatch and gunpowder and cold blood, and from the smouldering hospital, the stench of burning bodies. The defenders, their throats parched, their eyes red, their faces black from the residue of all that gunpowder smoke, peered out. Around them was a sea of 20,000 brass cartridge cases and a carpet of mealie corn from all those split bags that had been used on the perimeters. It was at this moment, with the sun rising, that Private Waters decided the coast was clear and made a run for the safety of the mission station, and was almost killed. Having run out of the hospital wearing Otto Witt's black cloak earlier in the evening, he'd hid in a ditch. And through that long night, Zulus had run across his prone body so many times that he was bruised all over his back. Finally, sometime during the night, he tried to sneak towards the British-held storehouse and had taken refuge en route in the tiny cookhouse in front of the burning hospital. To his horror, as he entered the cookhouse, he found there were some Zulus already in there, but they were so intent on shooting at the defenders, they didn't even notice his presence. Walters smeared his face with coal and then hid and fell back into the shadows, and amazingly, he was never noticed by the Zulus. And now, with the defenders venturing over the barricade, he decided the coast was clear, and he came out of the cookhouse. But with his blackened face and suddenly appearing, he was nearly shot by one of his own side. And then, at 7 a.m, the Zulu MP re-emerged. Safely out of the range of British rifles, they sat down to take snuff, rest, and assess the situation. I want you just to pause and think about what must have been going through their heads at this time. These Zulu warriors, mainly in their 30s and 40s, had not eaten for 3 whole days. They'd run barefoot over 70 miles from their capital of Ulundi to Isandlwana. They'd run over 10 miles from Isandlwana to Rorke's Drift, crossing the Buffalo River en route. They hadn't drunk water since they'd crossed the river 15 hours ago. Zulu folklore suggests that many of the warriors may have been on some sort of narcotic high in front of the battle. And if true, that meant they were probably having an almighty crash at about now. High or not, the Zulu warriors had fought a 10-hour battle on a day where temperatures had reached 40 degrees. And they'd come within a whisker of taking Rorke's Drift. They had attacked for 10 whole hours and faced nearly 20,000 bullets. Quite frankly, that takes some guts. The British soldiers had actually fired so many rounds that night. There were only 660 rounds left at the end of the battle, probably about 6 rounds per man. If the Zulu army had got up and launched one more sustained attack, they might have won. But they didn't. Exhausted, dispirited, the Zulus finally stood up and headed back towards the river and home. As they crossed the Buffalo River, they couldn't believe their eyes. Far off in the morning mist coming out of Zululand, they could see a ghostly British army marching towards them. But it wasn't the ghosts from the dead garrison at Isandlwana, but it was Lord Chelmsford and the other half of his column. The relief column broke into cheers when they saw the bedraggled defenders still holding the mission station at Rorke's Drift. The defenders were so exhausted they couldn't cheer back. Many opened their mouths, but absolutely no sound came forth. When a roll call was taken, it was found that 17 of the 130 defenders of Rorke's Drift had been killed, whilst around the mission station lay the bodies of 370 Zulu dead. Perhaps another 100 Zulus had been carried away by their comrades, while scores more had pulled themselves away to secluded spots nearby to die in solitude, and their bodies were recovered for many months afterwards. The British garrison had survived a terrifying ordeal. There is no doubt that they were brave, but like a lot of victories, they also had some luck on their side too. For instance, they had the materials to make, and some officers with experience to design, entrenched fortifications. They had 20,000 rounds of ammunition close to hand. And they were able to concentrate their fire and force the Zulus to fight on an increasingly narrow front, which meant that their superior numbers didn't really count. And here's a thought: if the Zulus had possessed better rifles or better trained marksmen, things might have been very different. And likewise, if they had not set fire to the hospital, they could have attacked through the night in complete darkness. What might have happened then? But these things didn't happen. In the end, the British, holding out against all odds, simply exhausted the Zulus. Victories come by many means, and so do defeats as well. 11 Victoria Crosses, the highest award for valour in the British Army, were awarded, the biggest number ever awarded for a single combat in the British Army's history. Privates Henry Hook, Robert Jones, William Jones and John Williams, or John Fielding, were, for their actions in the burning hospital, were awarded Victoria Crosses, as was Lance Corporal Allen and Private Fred Hitch, who had helped with the escape out of the window. Corporal Frederick Sheese of the Natal Mounted Police was also awarded a Victoria Cross, as was Surgeon Major James Reynolds. Acting Assistant Commissary James Langley Dalton was another recipient of the Victoria Cross, as was Commander of B Company, Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead. And finally, Lieutenant John Marriott Chard, Officer Commanding Rorke's Drift. One less glorious episode after Rorke's Drift was that some of Chelmsford's columns scoured the local area, killing any Zulus, either wounded or hiding, that they could find. Unlike the stories of the gallant defence by the garrison at Rorke's Drift, this particular story, strangely enough, didn't make it into the British newspapers. Ultimately, Chelmsford was to lead another invasion of Zululand later that year. This time with massive reinforcements. The result was never in doubt. The Zulu army was defeated outside the capital of Ulundi, and King Cetshwayo was captured, his kingdom annexed into the British Empire. His proud warriors, who'd fought so fiercely for their homeland and so bravely at Rorke's Drift, were forced to labour on white farms or in South Africa's gold and diamond mines. And what are the British heroes of Rorke's Drift? Well, I'd like to say they lived happily ever after, but unfortunately that wasn't always the case. In fact, I'm going to do a short video telling their stories, so watch out for that, and if you haven't already, subscribe so that you don't miss it. At the end of the day, Rorke's Drift is a story of two groups of incredibly brave soldiers, the Zulu warriors every bit as much as the British soldiers. But I think it also suggests that the two come together. That no matter where you come from, whether you're Zulus or British or any other nation, ordinary people will rise to extraordinary feats of bravery to support their families and their friends and their comrades. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video then please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of my new releases. And until next time, take care, and I look forward to seeing you very soon.